Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hi, this is Henry Gilroy, co-executive producer of Star Wars Rebels. You're listening to Aggressive Negotiations.
Congratulations, you have discovered the latest issue of Aggressive Negotiations, the Star Wars podcast on the Nerd Party Network that is coming to you every single week to explore the deep philosophical questions and also the silly sundries of the Star Wars galaxy. I'm one of your hosts, Jedi Master John Mills, and with me on this magical carpet ride of Jedi and Sith and Dathomiri fun is my good dear friend, Jedi Master Matthew Rushing. Matt, welcome once again to my side at Aggressive Negotiations.
Well, it's the only place you know that we will never sully your docket with nonsense about Star Wars. We're only here for... we'll talk about nonsense. Never mind.
Yeah. Our annual episode, Thanks Gunkin, that's kind of evidence that we love to talk about nonsense. And
it's very true. It's very true. I don't know. We still haven't done our deep dive into Jackson the Rabbit from the Marvel comics. So
don't even get me started, because if they're going to have a solo show or even a solo sequel, if Jackson doesn't show up, I'm going to be really mad. I'm going to be really super mad.
Be kind of funny if he did. Actually.
Oh my gosh! And let's not even get into how I want Hondo to pop up on The Mandalorian. That would be so fantastic, wouldn't it?
Oh, that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we know he's still alive because
That's right.
Black Spire Outpost. He's there,
Yeah.
so no
And
reason for him not to.
Exactly right. But before we get into today's topic, of course, we're part of the Nerd Party Network. It is a podcast home to a large number of shows that cover topics from Babylon 5 to Doctor Who to Star Trek to film festivals to nerd nuptials to Harry Potter to just about everything you can think of, including little shows like Retro Perspective, looking back at 1994, or Missing Frames, looking at movies that you haven't seen, but you should. Go over to thenerdparty.com. Check out all of these shows. They're fantastic. And, of course, go to thenerdparty.com/contact. You can locate Aggressive Negotiations and drop us a line there. We promise that we are listening to you. You can, of course, reach out to us on Twitter at the Jedi Masters. You can reach out to the network at Join Nerd Party, and look for the Nerd Party on Facebook and Instagram. And if you would be so kind, leave us a star rating and review over on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcatcher of choice you have. Okay, Matt. Something, we've been sort of exploring and getting excited about all of these different storytelling options. There are different ideas about the world between worlds and time travel having to do with Episode 9. The Mandalorian is a show that they've flat out said now it's going to help explore the origins that are heretofore unknown of the First Order. And something, I'm thinking about, because, these ideas get kicked around, is how Star Wars has always been a fertile ground for non-sequential storytelling, even when it hadn't yet on the big screen gone non-sequential with its storytelling. And Shadows of the Empire back in the 90s was our first big flashpoint with that, where we got a story inserted between Empire and Jedi that officially stated that, yes, time passed between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, when you could have viewed the films at that time as having occurred essentially back to back. So it's sort of an open point here that I want to start discussing with you is, has Star Wars always been so far ahead of its time that it has always primed its fans for this non-sequential, non-linear storytelling method, and as a result has always found an audience more receptive to the idea than the typical one?
Yeah, I think, that's a really good question. And I think it maybe even goes back further to the idea, Lucas had Alan Dean Foster do Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which was going to be ideas that could possibly be in the sequel if you never got to make the sequel, right? So, I mean, filling in the time period between the movie that had been made and the movie he hoped was coming, So the idea of kind of being able to tell a story in a part of the story that you'd already scene or you're between, it seems to really be something that Lucas was very familiar with. Obviously, the idea of the serials and all that kind of stuff. I think his idea is that you would always be telling just a part of the story, and there would always be parts of the story that could be filled in maybe later, but you wanted to make sure whatever your characters were, you were following them, and that their stories were told, but that they would kind of inspire and or spin off other ideas out there that could be followed up on later. And I think you're right, the idea of kind of the multimedia aspect to Shadows of the Empire, with it being a game and a book and all that kind of stuff, like that was also revolutionary. So I think, there you see kind of Lucas pushing the boundaries of what you might use to tell a story. And I think it's interesting to see, Star Wars really truly embracing that in this era where video games are canon, books are canon, comics are canon. All these things are telling this one massive Star Wars story. So yeah, I think you're right on target there. That he's seeing something in the future about how storytelling is going to be told, and it's not necessarily just at the movies.
Yeah, and I think you could even wind the clock back to The Empire Strikes Back when it came out with the episode 5 in front of it in the title crawl.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Caught a lot of people off guard because they said,
Yeah.
"Wait, what? Did I miss a couple of movies here? Like what's happening?" And people were thrown off until he added the episode 4 on the front of Star Wars, on the front of the title crawl. But in terms of this nonlinear stuff, there's also this odd tension that seems to occur with fans where there seems to be an additional resistance sometimes to the idea of this non-sequential stuff coming at them, because people calcify these ideas of how to see or interpret things that makes them not want to accept these stories that then insert something in and say, well, here's another aspect you haven't seen. And do you think that is simply because of the way people were conditioned to accept entertainment that wasn't Star Wars? Or do you think that is just something where Lucas was instinctively taking the audience somewhere where he knew, basically the idea that a truly successful storyteller takes the audience not where they want to go, but where they didn't realize they needed to go?
I think you have a point there. And I was thinking about, okay, what would it be? And especially now, and I think we've seen a change in the audience from the original Star Wars era and the prequel era to now, because think about the main form storytelling that we're getting at the theater that is just like taking over the world, which is Marvel. And everything there is sequential, right? There's very few places where they kind of go back and tell a story. I think the first time that I can think of that they've really done that with the films was the way that they did Captain Marvel, where it goes back and tells her story. Like it's a prequel to everything else. I guess the beginning of Captain America is definitely a prequel to everything else too. So, but for the most part, the storytelling that we're getting in Marvel is very linear. It's just one right after the other. It's chronological for the most part. And I think people have gotten really accustomed to that. Not only that, but I mean, you look at the storytelling you're getting on television and or streaming services, and everything is this very serialized storytelling that I think people have just become very accustomed to. And gone are the days of, sitcoms and that kind of stuff, even though Friends and, The Office are still the most streamed shows on Netflix. I just think maybe in some ways people have a hard time with that, and you can see that when people, when Rogue One came out, people were like, oh, is that about Rey? But wait, I thought this was before,
Right.
people getting confused, even though I don't know how you can possibly be confused. But there were people that were, and so, and I think another part of this all is just that, Star Wars itself, except for the main 6 films, haven't been in the cultural zeitgeist the way that other things have been. Like, we're inundated with the Clone Wars, right? That's and that kind of stuff, and the books and the comics, But for other people, Star Wars has just been those 6 films. And so it hasn't been something that's been continuous, right? And so I think, Star Wars itself kind of, it has struggled with the fact that it wanted to be something that it's not completely, not realizing what it is. And so, I don't know. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but it seems like there's a lot of different factors going through my mind right now that have kind of created a difference. But also, I would say at the same time, it's something that I think has very much worked in the Star Wars universe in a way that might not with other places, because I think the ground is so fertile with Star Wars that it isn't necessarily in any other franchise. Like, let me just, as an example, and I'm talking a long time, but I'm just thinking out loud, so I apologize.
No.
The Terminator franchise, right? I would say that the Terminator franchise is pretty played out.
Yes.
And, it's not a franchise and a mythology that lends itself to being mined over and over and over again. Star Wars, on the other hand, because of the way that it has been structured, this kind of mythological storytelling, these universal truths being told through myth, I think it allows itself to being mined over and over again to be able to tell these type of stories in a way that not every mythology does.
See, I the word mythology, obviously we all love to use it with Star Wars, but I think you're hitting on something specifically there because of the fact that mythology wasn't always something that we discovered. Like, there's almost an archaeological quality to it. How fitting that Lucas also invented Indiana Jones. There's an archaeological quality to Star Wars where it's like,
Yes.
You go on a different dig and you go to a different part of the galaxy and you say, oh, okay, well, this actually gives me a better idea of what was happening at this time because I've now discovered this thing that is different and I didn't quite understand it. So I think that's definitely there. I also think that there is, as we sit here talking about this, what I realize is that especially but even with current fans, I was going to say for, older fans, but also very much for current fans, because even if you just tuned in during this Disney era, we have sequel, prequel, sequel, prequel. And so you've already got the audience in this rhythm of the idea of the prequel, which further puts the audience in this situation where they're going to be basically Lucas has set up and prepared the audience, and the tradition is still going, what I would say is a safety valve. Because even if you encounter a story that you think wasn't dynamic, wasn't fantastic, you and I, we have our differences about Rogue One. Fine. People have their differences with us about Solo or about The Last Jedi or The Force Awakens. But simply because of the nature of Star Wars, I think maybe something that can keep people invested, even though they could say, I think the best example, Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens have 30 years between them. What happened during all of this time? This safety valve of knowing that at some point we're likely to get that information can, in a way, the way that the Clone Wars helped certain people come to accept the prequels more, we know that we're going to get something that's going to make the story fit in the way that we are able to plug into it better.
See, and I think, just thinking on that aspect, think about what is the big new show, the first big new show that's coming from Disney Plus. It's The Mandalorian, which is the fill-in for this time of lawlessness. This Dave and Favreau were I call him Dave. Sorry, Mr. Filoni and Mr. Favreau were. I just feel so close to Dave. You know.
You know what? You know what? Time out on that. I would say that Dave Filoni is the type of guy that has nested himself so securely in so many of our hearts that we feel like we know him. Just the same way we feel like we know Lucas, because we have spent so much time with him in his storytelling that we feel like family. And so, you know, don't beat yourself up for that. Come on, man. And the only reason to call him Favreau is because if you say John, I'll be like, why are you complimenting me so much? I don't get it. I didn't direct The Lion King.
That would be weird. So the thing I think that they both said was that this idea of, you know, just because you destroy the Death Star and you kind of take down the Empire doesn't mean that everything's perfect. You know, you basically end up with the end of the Roman Empire and chaos ensues, right? And that chaos is what we're going to be in The Mandalorian, which allows us to tell this story, this kind of Western story of the lone gunfighter, the man with no name, the man with no face, basically. But also to be able to start to integrate those things about the beginnings of the First Order and all that kind of stuff so we can build into this story. And I think, you know, to me, that's the exciting part of that, just like the Clone Wars, where there was so much story that George couldn't put in the films, but he knew the story was important and should be told somewhere, and he did. And I think, you know, that's the thing about the Star Wars universe, and the most important thing I think it is to figure out, okay, where are the stories that should be films, and where are the stories that should work better in this maybe long-form storytelling of television, animation, those kind of places. And I think that's the key for, you know, Lucasfilm to figure out. And it does feel like in some ways that they are seeing the validity of doing exactly what George was already doing, which with the Clone Wars, and, you know, he had been planning for that Underworld series, just waiting for technology to be able to afford that. And so you could already see that this was in his mind to go this way with Star Wars. Whether or not he ever did any more episodes or not, he saw the just open landscape of what it was to use television to tell these type of stories. And even to go back to your point, you know, one of our fun banters back and forth is the Clone Wars, you know, chronologically or just as it aired, you know, and the fact that even that was non-sequential, but not necessarily on purpose. It was more just George finding inspiration in the work they were doing and being like, oh, I want to tell a story about that, you know, and then so they would kind of do this prequel to other episodes you'd already seen. So, you know, I think you're absolutely right. In many ways, George just kind of realized you can do this with Star Wars really well. And I think you're right, too. He had kind of trained us for that in the way that Star Wars ended up being structured in the first weeks with the OT and then the prequels.
So with the fact that he's sort of, you know, trained an audience over time, you know, to expect and suspect that we were going to get these sorts of things, nonetheless, it seems that the sequels have had a very difficult time latching on with certain fans who would have preferred more time spent in that 30-year gap before Episode 7 showed up. And I think I will think that will always be a very interesting sort of thing, because I definitely could count myself in that number of, I think that there would have been a better sort of I don't want to say better, but a more ready acceptance among certain fans who weren't immediately in love with The Force Awakens if this prequel treatment stuff had come way harder on its heels. Where it was, you know, Force Awakens comes out, somebody comes out of the theater and is like, well, I don't know how I feel about it. Oh, look, here's this book that tells me what happened 5 years before. It could have been something that just, because with the Clone Wars, you always had these arcs, and then, you know, maybe the next season you would have something that suddenly was set before this one arc you weren't so sure about, and you were like, oh, okay, that arc makes it. So it was a way of of adding on to the arc retroactively. And I just sort of wonder if maybe Disney, maybe it's simply the fact that this would have been a more, and I don't want to say successful because these movies have been ridiculously successful in terms of money, but it's almost as if these movies came out just a little bit too early, considering the fact that we're now getting into the streaming game. Can you imagine if The Force Awakens had come out and they said, and guess what? Next month, you're going to get a brand new series telling about the era before this movie. Do you think that would have, there would have been a lot of people that said, well, I'll hold judgment until I see this other series, if it had been much more quickly delivered to them?
Yeah, I think that's an really interesting question, and I think that the baseline issue for the sequels was a lack of clarity, kind of a muddiness of the milieu we were stepping into 30 years later. And that lack of clarity has led a lot of fans to just kind of scratch their heads with lots of questions that didn't feel easily answered, that the other two trilogies don't suffer from.
Fair.
I don't think that's a lot to say or surprising to anybody, honestly. And so I think maybe possibly the wisest thing would have been to do is to spend more time laying out the story structure for that era, and then kind of pointing to where you wanted people to come, or at least having an idea of what that was in your head. Because George himself even had things that changed between doing the OT and doing the prequels and everything, where he finally kind of solidified what it was, but he had an idea enough so that you could place those markers in the OT so that when he goes back to the PT, he can fill in the gaps, and so with the sequel trilogy, it just didn't necessarily feel like it had enough of those markers to truly make us feel kind of comfortable in the world we got plopped into.
See, I think that actually ties into, and I will go through the rest of my fandom, holding my breath, stamping my feet, standing on a soapbox, however you want to put it, that the play they should have done is they should have had Force Awakens and then Solo, and then and then The Last Jedi, and some movie that tied in that sort of way, because since Solo works as a double feature, you have the end of Han's life in The Force Awakens, spoilers, and you have the start of his adventures in Solo. You see what I'm saying? Like they had the opportunity to have to basically, without the TV series sort of stuff, have this sort of rhythmic thing. And maybe that's the thing that Lucas was really able to plug into, was he had that rhythmic sense that even though it's a prequel, it still has to feel like it's tied to what you just saw in order to have that flow, because you're in that spot. You have that question already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing too is that anything that George had done in Star Wars kind of answered a question in many ways that had already come up. And so, and you didn't already feel like there was a nice bow to it, right? Like, so the prequel series answers a lot of questions that came into your mind when you thought, oh, I wonder what that Clone Wars thing is. And, I wonder, you've got this backstory with Obi-Wan and Anakin once you get to the end, and with Obi-Wan, that's really interesting. I wonder what really happened all the way back, So we began to create these stories in our mind, and so George went and answered those with the prequels. And then, during the prequels, we all thought, well, we didn't get to really see the Clone Wars. I wonder what happened in the Clone Wars. I
Right.
feel like there's probably lots of stories there. So what does George do? He goes and answers those questions with the Clone Wars. And so, and part of that is that by doing each thing, he subtly is able then to shift your perspective. Even though you know what's going to come afterwards, it changes your view on what you see before and after once you view the new material. And that's the most important thing, I think, that George really encapsulated with what he did, whether he was doing it, out of order or whatever. It was always in a way that made whatever you saw better or different, or there was something about what came that he was giving you at that moment that was going to change what you knew of Star Wars before and after.
But he was also, I think, very smart in not necessarily answering every single question, not becoming obsessed with minutia, because the story of how Anakin, and we've talked about this on a previous episode, the story of how Anakin got that scar on his face is not precisely answered in the annals of Star Wars history still. And so there's always these little tantalizing things where he's answering these big questions, he's giving these new revelations, but he always leaves just a little bit for you to hold on to and play with in your own mind. So it becomes even interactive in that sense to allow you to play with it on your own terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think part of that too, everything always flows within the mythology in the sense that it's continuing the larger sweeping themes of all of Star Wars. And I think, Dave obviously was able to tap into that with the Rebels series as well, leading into the time of the rebellion. And I think that's the thing that I find myself most interested in with The Mandalorian of, following up then Return of the Jedi, and in a way that feels completely, kind of consistent with where we'd go, is that there is this time, even in the old EU, we start with the Thrawn trilogy originally, and that's 5 years later. And only then are they really, able to have, they kind of have started to have a peace or whatever. But they're still dealing with Imperial Remnant, like a guy like Thrawn. The Mandalorian, I think, is 6 years, and you're still kind of in this place of chaos where there's pockets of the Empire still there, and things aren't going great everywhere yet, because there's this fledgling new republic and all. And so I think the question then that they're answering with The Mandalorian is the question that many of us have had: what happened next?
Well,
and The Mandalorian is going to answer that, but in a way that we're not following like Luke, Leia, and Han.
right.
We're going to see it through the eyes of somebody completely different, which is pretty exciting, actually.
Well, it's going to be something to be focused on the world building as opposed to, connecting the dots with our characters sort of thing, which I think is, everybody would have to admit is one of the most intriguing aspects of the prequels, is that the way that it just sort of blows up the world of Star Wars and makes it so much bigger and so much more complex than the original trilogy originally did. But it's funny because you mentioned Heir of the Empire, and it's 5 years later, and there's still, it's the first story that we get, and there's still the Empire. But then we also go then I think it was right after that. I could be wrong in terms of release order, but I think right after that was Truce at Bakura, which then occurred immediately after Return of the Jedi. And then I think we jumped to Courtship of Princess Leia, which was 2.5 years after. So there was already that jumping around during the Bantam Books era that I think maybe I missed a little bit when they moved on to the Yuuzhan Vong era, because that seemed to be much more sequential than that sort of freewheeling. It's very rare that I sing the praises of the pre-prequel expanded universe, as anybody who's heard me rant for any amount of time, but that Bantam era was so much fun because the books would come out in this crazy order where it would, and that's where they had to start putting the timelines in, because you were like, wait, when does this book happen? Why is Luke like this and he's not like? And so that was a really interesting and complex sort of way to go about it.
I think one of the most interesting things too is that to me, and this whole conversation is in many ways it's interesting to kind of see Disney, and Bob Iger came out and kind of admitted that they had made some mistakes up front. They had rushed some things and all of that. And I think what we're seeing now from Lucasfilm is a much more measured response, and a much more measured thought process as to what they're going to do and why they're going to do it. And I think that's one of the reasons that we still know nothing about any of the next feature films coming out, is because they're really spending the time to put those together and really legitimize where it is that they want to go within themselves before they bring it to the public, which I think is really smart. And yet at the same time, they're seeing the validity of doing these things that George had done, which is finding a way to answer the questions which fans have. And I do think, looking across a wide swath of fandom, some of the most pressing questions, especially for the sequel trilogy, have been those questions of like, okay, what's up with the First Order? What's up with this character Snoke? What happened? All of those kind of questions, because they have ramifications then on the films that we got. And one of the things that excites me is that a show like The Mandalorian has the opportunity to completely recontextualize the sequel trilogy for me in a way that could make it incredibly more enjoyable because of the knowledge that it could bring. And of course, obviously, I think we both hope the same thing for what we'd get in The Rise of Skywalker as well.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the thing that, telling these type of stories where, people could call it spackling, in, the holes or whatever, but the best thing that these stories have done, and Lucas really set the template, which is to be able to tell a story that recontextualize everything that came before and after, so that, when I watched episodes of the Clone Wars, everything that I thought back to in episode 1 and 2 was seen differently, and then episodes 3 through 6 was seen differently. And that's the kind of thing that you can do with this type of storytelling, and with the mythology, I think, of Star Wars allows that to happen in the same way that, a storyteller sitting in ancient Rome could weave tales of, a Jupiter and all of these gods, and tell different stories on different days, and some of them may have been beforehand or after the ones he had told before, but they all kind of fit together in a way that allowed the people listening to those stories have a fuller, better understanding of, the god Jupiter.
Well, there's sort of this this aspect of it as well that it seems sort of like extended flashbacks, and we all love flashbacks in films and stuff like that. But also is something that with a recent film that really struck a chord with me that I really, really enjoyed, which was Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I think that is also, if you were to distill this nonlinear storytelling style into a single film, I think that is a terrific example, specifically because it jumps around and has these different, it feels free to slide in without any necessarily clear transition, that what you're seeing now is a story from this, and then that one tells a story from beforehand, and then you jump forward again, and you're at the end of it. Like when he's recollecting certain things on top of the rooftop or something like that. I think that there's a very natural tendency among storytellers to embrace this idea of the rabbit hole, and that I think the whole nonlinear prequel storytelling style is the embrace of that rabbit hole mentality of, oh yeah, and I was going along as blah, 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 and you're telling the story, and then somebody says, well, what about this? Oh yeah, well, what happened with that was, and it's that there's this, I think that there's this implicit excitement with the way that stories are told like that, that just makes you really look forward to it, because you know that you can't necessarily anticipate what's going to come next, but you're going to want to hear it because it's got to fit in. So, it's almost like watching a magician, where you want to know how the trick is going to happen. You know that you're going to get tricked. You know that there's going to be some sleight of hand, and you're trying to figure out how he's doing the trick. But at the same time, there's that joy of just seeing him pull it off that makes you a willing and happy audience member.
And this might be a bad example for some people, but for me, it's something that's been interesting, as I do Owl Post with Drea. And, we've been going through the Harry Potter series one chapter at a time. And, now that Rowling has been diving back into the prehistory of the Harry Potter series with the Fantastic Beasts series, and that series really, more so than it, and in a lot of ways being about Newt, has a lot more to do with Dumbledore and his character. And Dumbledore's always kind of an enigma, really, in the Harry Potter series. We get to know a lot about him, but not a lot about him internally, like as a character, very much. So she's really exploring that character and bringing him to life in a whole new way now. And actually, I found myself really finding it interesting then rereading, like we just did the major chapter where he explains to Harry the ramifications of everything that's been happening in the Order of the Phoenix and this big prophecy. So just kind of seeing some that character in a new light, and I think, anybody, again, any storyteller who does that well and has kind of crafted a universe that is kind of, in many ways, has more of kind of a mythology base. And when we say mythology, I think it's we don't mean that in the, I wouldn't say that the colloquial sense, like, oh, the Terminator mythology. Terminator doesn't really, I don't think, have mythology in that sense. I would say the Terminator story, because to me, mythology is something that not only is a function of story, but it's also a function of connecting to the universal themes of human existence. And I think that's the thing that something like a Star Wars does in a way that any great mythologies have. Honestly, when you look at history, I think that's the reason that's resonated so long with so many people, and what makes it such a fertile playground. Then, so yeah, I think what all of this to say is that it's interesting to look back and kind of see that Lucas was a man who was always ahead of his time. Mm-hmm. And he was a man ahead of time with technology, with storytelling. I mean, being able to see that what he needed to do was to tell a kid's story, basically, instead of Apocalypse Now, because he felt like that's what the world truly needed at that point, other than another depressing war story, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, he was right there. He was right on pushing movies forward with technology, and continuing to pour his money back into those ideas. I think the way that he foresaw the ways that TV could be a place to tell incredible stories. I think he foresaw the renaissance of basically like the Game of Thrones before it came out, because he already had the idea with this Underworld series.
Yeah. For sure. I mean, Lucas was, you're absolutely right, always a step ahead, and always, that's one of his great, longest lasting, most enduring legacies, is the fact that he was somebody who was invested in it, not just for the sake of making a movie that people loved, but for he had a passion for truly moving everything. He wanted, the rising tide to lift all ships sort of thing, where he wanted everybody to be able to go out and tell a story in a really interesting and new and exciting way, that really let their own vision make it across. And, to your point now about Apocalypse Now and Star Wars, I'd love to do that as a double feature now. it would be a very long double feature because I think Apocalypse Now is somewhere around 13 hours. I kid. I just got the final cut, so I would actually be really interested to see the Apocalypse Now Star Wars double feature to try to have this discussion, after you watch both films back to back, of both of these films are speaking to the same generation of moviegoers, and to your point about making a quote unquote kids movie, both of them resonated, both of them were enjoyed, adored, have become lasting landmarks, but they're so incredibly different from each other, but they're both informed by the same sense of we have to address these issues that are sitting on the cultural psyche right now, and just a different way. Two different filmmakers can go two different ways in terms of expressing how to deal with what everybody is thinking about. And that would be just, I think, really, really fascinating. And then, of course, if you want to get weird about it, throw a Taxi Driver into the mix because, hey, why not?
So what you're saying is that you think that we should basically do this as a show, so that I can see Apocalypse Now for the first time.
Excuse me?
I know, I've never seen it.
See, first and foremost, you reject my Ace of Base and ABBA theory from last week. But now you're going to come at me and tell me you haven't seen Apocalypse Now? My mind is blown.
Just one I haven't gotten around to seeing.
I haven't seen the final cut yet, but I can tell you that I'm a guy that prefers the Redux, which was the recut of Apocalypse Now that came out in the 90s, to the theatrical cut. But I know there are people who prefer the theatrical cut. And before we have that open up a whole can of worms about a director's right to have their say over what the final cut of the film is, where can people find you on? Where can people find you online, Matt, to discuss these sorts of things?
Well, I'm sure I will get tons and tons of messages about how awful I am that I have not seen Apocalypse Now, and you can do that at MattRushing02. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, and Vero, so I guess you can yell at me in any of those places. As I mentioned here, I'm on the network doing Owl Post with Drea Kaufman as we talk about Harry Potter each and every week, one chapter at a time. In fact, we are doing our very last chapter of The Order of the Phoenix. So we are wrapping that book up and looking towards now the Half-Blood Prince. So very excited about that. You can find me on the Track FM network. I do a couple shows there. One is called The Orb with Chris Jones, where when we get a chance, we talk about Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, that is. You can also find me doing the 602 Club, which is our general geek show. And, John actually frequents there every once in a while. In fact, this week, you can find him talking Death of Superman with me and the animated version. So you can find that on the Trek FM network, and we do all sorts of fandoms. So Star Wars, Harry Potter, you name it, we're doing it. And then last but not least, you can find me doing Cinema Stories with my good friend Courtney. John, if anybody wants to get on you for your love of the Redux cut instead of the theatrical cut, where can people find you?
Oh, well, you can find me trolling around on the internet, praising ABBA and loving any cut of Apocalypse Now. My name is Kessel Junkie. I'm a little more active on Twitter than I should be, but hey, that's life. You can also find me writing my reviews over on Letterboxd, and you can, under the same username, Castle Junkie. And you can find me co-hosting a show called Retro Perspective right here on the Nerd Party Network, where Mike Schindler and I are slow walking through 1994 and enduring one release week at a time, just in the hopes of eventually getting to Pulp Fiction and some other good stuff. But it's a lot of fun, and be sure to pay attention to the episode titles, because it's always one of us versus something else is the way we phrase it. So, but in the meantime, while I wait for anybody to reach out, and you were waiting for anybody to reach out, my Jedi communicator beacon has gone off, and I think it is time to return to the temple. So I think it's time to close these negotiations.
John, negotiations are closed.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.